Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the Sudan's possibilities for having a transitional justice process as part of the revolution. And a particular welcome to the panelists. In Khartoum, we have Professor Munzoul Assal. We have from the University of Juba, but sitting in Cameroon, we have Kuyang Logo, and here at CMI we have Elin Skaar, political scientist, expert on transitional justice, and myself, Gunnar Sørbø, who, with a background in Sudan studies, I will try my best to lead us through the discussion. And I think also a particular welcome to our viewers from Sudan. I want to start with you, Munzoul. You know, and you remember that there were three slogans as part of the revolution in 2019. They were freedom, peace, and justice. And they formed the slogan of the revolution, so to speak. And many will say that the first two are perhaps slowly, but still beginning to take shape. But the third one seems to be lagging behind. There was, as part of the constitutional declaration set up in 2019 in August, as far as I remember, a commission to work on the issue of atrocities committed by the former regime. There have also been a commission working and set up in late 2019 to identify those responsible for the bloody repression of the revolution in its early stages. It has still not delivered its conclusions. So there are concerns and there are worries, as you know, in Sudan and elsewhere about this. So maybe, Munzoul, if you start, can you take us through a bit on the political situation as you see it at the moment, the complexities, but also, of course, with a particular view of the possibilities for achievements in the area of justice.
Thank you, Gunnar, and I'm glad to be with you on this timely and important webinar. Yes, the three slogans raised during the revolution, freedom, peace, and justice, were actually the backbone of the change that took place. You might have been a bit optimistic when you said that the two are somehow coming, but the third one is not there yet. I am less optimistic, and I can say that, as a matter of fact, the first one, the freedom, we have done, so to speak, good on that level, because now people can express themselves freely in ways that they want. But the two other fronts are still far from being even, approached, at least as far as I'm concerned. Peace has started. We have the Juba peace agreement. We might talk about it a bit. And still the government is negotiating with the SPLM, and Abdul Wahid is still not part of it. But the political situation is still quite tense, quite fragile. And you might have followed the news yesterday that Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok has an initiative of 8 points. He called for what he calls reconciliation. But reading his speech, I gathered that he was merely trying to tell the different partners in the transitional government to put their act together, and so that the transition can move forward in a better way than hitherto. Of course, all these aspects are related closely to the economic situation in the country, which is also quite difficult, quite tough. Inflation is soaring, although the recent economic changes that the government implemented seems to be going in the right direction, especially lifting subsidies completely from fuel and other things, and also the government is taking further steps to consolidate the policy. I think in the long run, this is the right path. It's tough, it's difficult for a lot of people, but this is the only way that the economy can pick up, and we may actually try or be able to reap the benefits of this policy in the coming few months. We do hope so. But the critical issue for me is the tensions within the partners of the transition. And by this, I mean tensions between, on the one hand, the military and the civilians, and on the other hand, tensions within the civilian component itself. We have been following this. Some of the civilian components are part of the government, but they behave as if they are in the opposition. And so this is making a lot of confusion. And I think Hamdok was quite frustrated with this situation. And that was why he came out with his initiative of yesterday, where he called, this is an 8 points initiative. If I may go very quickly, he talked about unifying the transition groups. He talked about having a unified and professional army. He talked about unifying decision-making centers. He talked about one foreign policy. He talked about implementing the Juba peace agreement. He talked about boosting local production, uprooting the former regime structures, commitment by all to democracy, equality in citizenship, and eventually fair elections. These are actually the points that were made by Hamdok in his yesterday's initiative. So far, I haven't followed the political discussions yet, but I think this is a positive development, and Hamdok, I think, is becoming quite vocal in the last couple of weeks. He had a speech last week, and yesterday he came out with this initiative. So he is perhaps, after succeeding in putting Sudan back to the international community, he is now giving attention to the local dynamics and local problems that are actually working to the determinant of the transition. I think I will stop here, and then we may come back to some of these issues later.
But just a follow-up question, is there a lack of vision when it comes to issue of transitional justice? I remember the Prime Minister talked about this even when he started, as a Prime Minister. He used the word, the need for transitional justice. But is there a lack of vision about what this implies, or is it just that there are so many tensions, as you say, between different components and complexities, that it's impossible to pursue any line of vision, even if you have one?
Yeah, well, I think you are absolutely right, and one of the reasons why the transitional justice is delayed is the brutal crash of the sit-in, because there is a committee that's investigating this. The committee is having a lot of problems and challenges. Some of these are technical, others are political, of course, and having not been able to reach conclusions on that issue is delaying the process of transitional justice. And surprisingly enough, all the different groups in the transition are convinced that transitional justice is actually one way of resolving these complex problems, because people here would think that criminal justice alone is not going to serve the purpose, because it's unthinkable to have Hemetor or Burhan being tried during the transition. This is not going to happen. But this doesn't mean that those who are responsible for crimes will get away with it. They will definitely be brought to justice, but how that is happening or how that should happen is a matter of debate. And as far as I understand, there is a draft of the law of transitional justice, but I'm not sure how far the process has gone, whether this is approved by the cabinet or not yet. But the whole process is delayed, and the reasons for delay, as far as I can say, one, the investigation on the crash of the sit-in is not concluded, and the tensions among the different partners in the transition also delays the process of transitional justice, because some people have a lot of misunderstanding about what transitional justice means. For some people, they would say that transitional justice would mean that a lot of people will get away with what they did. For others, transitional justice is one way of dealing with a complex situation like what's happening in Sudan. So this is, I think, why we are not there yet. But I think everybody is convinced that this is needed.
Before I turn to the other two on the panel, just another question. I think we should try to focus on what can possibly be achieved even on modest levels. Because you have these modalities of justice. You have the issue of punitive justice. Should we send Bashir to The Hague and so on and so forth? You have issues of reconciliation. You have traditional mechanisms like in Darfur, where you have the Judea system as we know it, of mediation, during conflicts. Could there be a kind of a stepwise, given these complexities that it seems to me will last for a long time? Because it's not only about the military and the civilian components, it's also about all these tensions within the civilian components, and there are these so-called other armed groups, and I'm sure they have committed atrocities in the eyes of many people also. So in this complex situation, could something be in a stepwise fashion perhaps be achieved? How do you think about this?
I think this is a very realistic way of looking at the complexity. And I do agree with you that even this transitional justice could be looked at as a process which can be done step by step. There are different levels. There are very local levels. For instance, in Darfur, even way before the downfall of Bashir, 2018, I visited Darfur. Actually, I visited the 5 states. I was doing some work, and then by talking to people at the very local levels, I could realize that there is a process of reconciliation that was going on. Some of those who occupied the farmlands of others agreed to leave those farms, and the farmers who own those lands said, well, now that you agreed to leave our lands, we will give you a chance to farm this year, and then we can take our lands next year, so that you will not lose the crops that you already cultivated. So these are the local initiatives and the systems that you talk about, like Judea, where people sit together and solve problems. Transitional justice could actually start at this very grassroots level, and then we can move up there. And this means that we should not wait until everything is done together. We can start the process step by step, and then we see where that will lead us. Because as far as I can remember, and since I was able to remember, Sudan has always been in this kind of complex situations, but life goes on. And I think we need to think positively, we need to think creatively, so that we can start the process, put the first steps, and then we build on that.
Thank you so far, Munzoul. We lost your picture now, but I hope it will come back. I will turn to Kuyang from the University of Juba. You have written about this issue on South Sudan, where you have different types of complexities and a very difficult political situation. And you have also been concerned with whether or not there would be lessons from South Sudan which are relevant for Sudan. Can you say something about this? Are you with us?
Yes, thank you very much. And as you rightfully said it, there is a natural link, between the situation in Sudan and in South Sudan, in terms of, a shared history, but also the quest for justice, reconciliation, and peace building. So I will pick from the concluding points of Professor Munzoul, which also touched on, some key points that my blog post for CMI raised. As you may be aware, the approach in South Sudan, to transitional justice, especially after the conflict in 2013, was to embed transitional justice as key components of peacemaking. And during the negotiations of the 2016 peace agreement and the 2018 agreement, an entire transitional justice chapter was embedded with 3 key mechanisms around reconciliation. Importantly this time, the intentions of that are twofold. First of all, it takes me back to 2005 when the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed, and it didn't have very strong mechanisms of transitional justice. Reconciliation was mentioned very fleetingly, and it was incumbent upon parties in Sudan and in the South to implement, and that did not happen. So this time around, the change is to ensure that these are embedded in the peace agreement to avoid the mistakes of the CPA. And secondly, the way the conflict was manifesting, atrocities were being committed by both parties to the conflict. So, this time around, there was an intention to ensure that perpetrators of atrocities are brought to account for, for human rights violations that were really worrisome. But again, as I wrote in the blog post, the context of South Sudan itself is one that truly falls out of the realm of transitional justice, practice and scholarship. It's a context with no form of political transition, no form of democratic, transitions. And so we have short periods of transitions included as part of peace agreements that do not even fall within the real definition of transition. So essentially, that meant that the context itself is extremely complex. It's a situation where political and military elites are too powerful. The human rights environment is too repressive. National security actors are too powerful and clamp on voices, dissenting voices of people who would want to even advance transitional justice mechanisms linked to prosecution. And naturally, there's a struggle now with regards to the establishment of the hybrid court. And it's to be expected, because no incumbent would want to prosecute himself. So there are political games around, the establishment of the hybrid court. So there's a delay tactics by both the military and political elite. And at one time, the military's elite said that should they be prosecuted, they will blow the country up. So there's that tussle and struggle. But then what's very interesting, and just like it has been in traditional transitional justice discourses, there seems to be an acceptance of mechanisms of reconciliation. As I speak right now, the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing, this conversation about it, the Ministry of Justice is beginning work and other stakeholders are supporting that. Reparations is equally accepted, and maybe those are the few positive things that I can be able to pick in the process and lessons for other fragile contexts, that there are certain acceptable mechanisms that can be taken forward to start a process to avoid a situation of being in limbo and sticking on the most unacceptable mechanism. Why not look at the others, which are more acceptable and tolerated by the incumbent regime? So we also had a national dialogue, which took a very long time, a presidential initiative. Despite its shortfalls, it provided an opportunity for citizens to just talk about what happened to them. And in actually one of the recommendations at the grassroots level, the people say they don't want Riek Machar, they don't want Kiir as leader. They say that, now we're left with the implementation of the peace agreement as I conclude. And we think that there are few bits and pieces of processes around reconciliation, reparations that can happen. But then we're also looking at upcoming elections. Will the elections provide a form of transition? Will the elections even be credible? Will we even have the election? So I think for now, let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our screen up here is dark, so we don't see anybody. So if we could just fix that, so you'll come back to us and we can watch your faces. Yes. Thank you very much. I think definitely there are both similarities and differences between the two countries, and of course one, as you said, one difference is that you still have Salva Kiir on top of the regime there, while the Sudanese got rid of Omar al-Bashir, and there are people who would like to see both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, actually. So it's another type of complexity. Before turning to Elin Skaar to talk a little bit about comparative experience, I just want to ask Munzoul about this issue of handing over or not handing over the former president to The Hague. The outgoing prosecutor of the ICC was just in Khartoum and even traveled to Darfur, Bensouda. She will be substituted now with a new English, I think, prosecutor. But there have been, since the revolution, there have been dialogues with the ICC, but nothing is happening. And it is a controversial issue also among those who led the revolution, to hand over, not to hand over, because it's, on the one hand, it would be a sort of real thing to do in terms of justice, but also symbolically very potent, perhaps. How do you view this at the moment?
Well, I think there is an agreement among the partners in the transitional government that those who are wanted by the ICC should be handed. I think this has been settled. This was even mentioned in the Juba peace agreement. I don't think there is a lot of wrangling here. I think what remains is just a matter of how this is going to be done. There are some legal issues that need to be dealt with because the Sudanese law is still forbid the handing of a citizen to a foreign. That is part of the legal system. But I think there is an agreement. And Bensouda, while she was here, she specifically asked for Ahmad Harun to be handed to, because I think there is some link with him and the Koshep, who is already in The Hague. And ironically, both Bashir and Ahmad Harun said that they would prefer to be in The Hague than sitting in Cooper's prison, where they're suffering from mosquito bites and these kind of things. But I think this is going to happen. For Bashir specifically, they were talk about whether he should be sent to The Hague or whether the ICC will come and the trial takes place in Sudan. That is also one of the things on the table. But in principle, I don't think there are big objections in handing over these people to the ICC.
Therefore, the formal response of the government has been so far that they still have a case going against Bashir for other issues related to corruption. That is sort of a kind of a very long-lasting case, where he has this very large number of lawyers working for him. and that this goes on and on. This has been sort of the formal response. We have to end this case of corruption, then we can turn to other issues. This seems to be, but I wonder if this is just a kind of a formal response, and that there is a lot of politicking behind, you know, the delays.
No, that's true. I agree with you. There are a lot of politics there.
Yeah. Maybe I'll turn to you, Elin. You know the situation in many other countries, and you have also touched upon Sudan in a blog you wrote. How do you, when you hear this about these complexities and so on, from Munzoul particularly, well, how do you see this from your comparative perspective? How should we think about justice in Sudan? What can we learn?
What can we learn? I mean, to be honest with you, some of the discussion and things that we have been hearing from Kuyang and Munzoul actually set me about 30 years back in time. Because I think the problems that Sudan and South Sudan are facing at the moment are very similar to those faced by other countries in other parts of the world in other times. As you know, I've done my fieldwork in Latin America and the southern part of Latin America, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. And although these contexts are very different from Sudan, they still have many of the same challenges. If you look at the Latin American context, pretty much the entire continent was dominated by either military authoritarian dictatorships or civil wars. Throughout the 1970s, large parts of the 1980s, and well into the 1990s, with civil wars raging in Central America. And all of these countries, at some point, at the time of transition mostly, were faced with the choices, you know, what to do with human rights violations. And I think if you compare the scale of violations in Sudan with the scale of violations in many Latin American countries, the scale of atrocities are much smaller. So for some countries, we're talking just a handful of casualties, but in some countries like Guatemala, with 36 years of civil war, there were about 200,000 people killed, massacred, mainly indigenous people. So the question, of course, is what does a government do? And even at the beginning of the 1980s, this was right at the beginning of what we call transitional justice as a scholarly field. It was just emerging then. The government in Argentina was facing pretty much the same challenge. And it was, what do we do with generals? It is the only country in Latin America, and only one of two in the world, that have actually managed to prosecute their heads of state or the military junta leaders at the time of transition. And I'm saying this because I want to bring in the question of timing, which has been touched upon by the other two previous speakers here. In Argentina, the military have been very strong. They had various military juntas over a long period of time. But then they lost the war against Britain, the Falklands War in the early 80s. This weakened the military, and the transitional government thought, ooh, we can prosecute. And this was actually part of the presidential promise in Argentina. Alfonsín promised to prosecute the entire military. The court started the processes, and very soon the military revolted. So there was one revolt, there were two revolts, there were three revolts, and the government decided, oh, this is too politically touchy. The military is weakened by losing the war against Britain, but it still has the weapons, you know. And what the transitional government thought at the time was, it was much better to try to preserve the very fragile democracy than to continue pushing for wide-scale prosecutions. So what they did was they first passed one amnesty law, saying that they basically limited the time that cases could be brought to court. And of course, cases were flooding to the courts. So they decided that they couldn't really handle the number of cases. It was too politically fragile. So they had another amnesty law saying that only those who took orders from high-level militaries could not be prosecuted. So they basically went for the top brass, you know, the al-Bashir and the close colleagues. So in the end, they managed to prosecute 9 generals from the juntas, and they only they had 5 convictions. They stayed in jail just for a couple of years, and then there was a change in the democratic government. The next president pardoned the lot. They were out of jail like that. And then 20 more years went by before they started prosecutions again. And that was after several different democratic governments, and they got rid of the amnesty laws, and there was public, there was a civilian demand for justice in Argentina for many, many, many years. Finally, the courts started again, but that was in a very different political context. So while the regime was still fragile, it turned out to be pretty much impossible to continue with prosecution. And the lesson that Argentina went through has served as an example for 20 other countries in the region. So nobody else actually tried to prosecute their top military brass at the time of transition. However, many years down the lane, 10 years down the lane, 20 years down the lane, sometimes 30 years later, prosecutions have started. And that includes after the bloody civil wars in El Salvador and in Guatemala, where casualties were very high, civilian suffering was horrible, and many, basically the whole populations were affected in one way or the other because the conflict was so deep, animosity was so high, and the political fragility was so high in the beginning that it took many, many years. So I think one of the lessons then, to get back to your question for Sudan, is that at least if you want to go down the lane of criminal prosecution, that lane is full of political bumps. And as long as you have the military in a transitional government or a coalition government, or they're outside the government, but they still control the weapons, I think it's really, really hard to get prosecutions without provoking the military into action. So in some ways then, if you pull the peace versus justice dichotomy, most governments will say that it's better to preserve the peace than to pursue justice. If you can do both, that's even better. But a lot of times that is not politically possible. So I think that's one lesson for Sudan. Of course, Sudan is more complex because you have international actors on the scene, which most Latin American countries haven't had, except for Colombia. Which means that you have a pressure from the international donor community, you have pressure from the ICTJ, International Center for Transitional Justice, which I know has been involved in South Sudan. And you have the ICC, of course, taking over in a way the job that Sudan hasn't been able to do itself, which is to prosecute him in national courts. So the ICC steps in, and this hasn't happened in Latin America. So this is a different political setting, which maybe skews the balance a bit in terms of power when it comes to prosecutions. And I have many more things I could say, but maybe I should stop there because this was the prosecutions part.
No, but this is very relevant, of course. And in addition, or different from Latin America, you now have a hybrid government in Sudan, like in Myanmar. You could even risk Sudan becoming another Myanmar, although fortunately, I would say the complexities are on the military side are such that there is no unified military. So it's unlikely that it would be so easy for the military to take over. So there are these problems that are also, in a way, advantages for the revolution, so to speak. But otherwise, I think the lessons are there to be learned. And I think also maybe a difference would be that Sudan, being very complex in terms of ethnic and other compositions and experiences from war, Darfur, the Nuba Mountains being particularly hard hit, would be different from, say, what has happened in Eastern Sudan or Northern Sudan and so on. So you could think, I think, Munzoul, that you were also touching upon this and agreeing that there could be different thinking for different regions in the Sudan, in terms of particularly if you don't think about criminal justice necessarily, but maybe more on reconciliation, truth commissions, kind of issues, There could be differences, but it would also be very demanding to establish perhaps different systems for transitional justice in different parts of the country. I'm not sure. It brings me to another and maybe very important issue of the necessity for reform of the judicial system. What can be achieved from the judicial system as it has been set up, and what is happening on that front in Sudan?
Thank you. I think I have to stress the point that you mentioned earlier, that Sudan has a very rich tradition when it comes to reconciliation, when it comes to achieving justice, when it comes to dealing with difficult, problems. So there is a base, there is a possibility, but then comes the complexity that Elin has mentioned, the fact that when the military is powerful, it would be very difficult to have prosecutions, while not angering the military, and that is actually one of the key challenges that are facing Sudan at the moment. The military is quite nervous. Of course, they are implicated in what happened in Darfur and other areas, and on top of all that, they are also part of what happened in the 3rd of June 2019. And all this makes them quite vulnerable, quite nervous, but they are still open to possibilities of dealing with this issue. I'm quite sure about that. And one of the reasons that make me say this is the fact that Musa Hilal, who is also one of the figures in the country, was recently released from jail, and if that can happen, then a lot of other things could also happen. Now, with regard to the reform in the judiciary, that is actually one of the very challenging and difficult issues. Last month, the government fired both the Attorney General and the Chief Justice. They were accused of being lenient. And one of the challenges that are facing the transition government is the fact that the judiciary is completely dominated by the former regime loyalists. And of course, this is also at the various levels of the government, including the military and security. We have to be very frank about this. And the dominance of these people in these structures impedes the work of the transition. And I think one of the 8 points mentioned by Hamdok in his initiative of yesterday is point number 7, which is the necessity of uprooting former regime structures. And I think if this is not done, then it would be very difficult to talk about real reform in the judiciary. And let us not forget the fact that since January 2020, we don't have constitutional court. And if we don't have constitutional court, we cannot think of having fair and democratic elections. That's not going to happen. So a key challenge for the transition is reforming the judiciary. I really don't know how this is going to happen, but that is one of the critically important issues. If we are talking about achieving justice, whether through transition justice or any other form, we need to have a new judiciary that is, not loyal to the former regime.
A comment from you on this?
Yeah, this is just echoing the situation in Latin America. So when you had transitions to democracy in the 80s and the 90s, it was accompanied by judicial reform in practically every country. And that means reform of the courts at the lower levels, but it also meant appointment procedures, reform of appointment procedures for Supreme Court justices, because these were very often tied to the former regime, because they were appointed by the military or by authoritarian governments. And they, of course, protected the interests of the government. So you had to get rid of them before you actually had any proper justice processes in the courts. So I think it's a classic dilemma when countries come out of conflict, because the courts are usually packed with allies from the former regime. So you have to get rid of them and start with fresh people before you can actually get anything going. Another problem, of course, with the courts is not only the people and the judges in the courts, but also the resources that courts have. I mean, when you've had conflicts going on for a long time, typically courts have been very, very weak. Sometimes they haven't even functioned, or only parts of them have functioned. So, I mean, and you don't have to look to Latin America. I mean, I'm thinking of Angola and Mozambique. After years of civil war, they basically had to rebuild the court system pretty much from scratch. And you can't really expect courts to do much in terms of criminal justice for past violations when they, in addition, are handling all the criminal and civil law cases that any society has to deal with. So dealing with past crimes is just like an extra layer that courts in new democracies or after conflict have to deal with. So I fully understand Sudan's dilemma here.
And I think also, and I think this situation would be similar in South Sudan, that many of the conflicts in Sudan have also been initially local conflicts or localized conflicts, and then over time they have been entangled in larger size macro conflicts, very much affected by them, so being part of them, so to speak. And in Sudan, you would have traditional mechanisms for handling some of the local conflicts. Some of these mechanisms have been threatened by the fact that they are entangled with a larger size conflict. But I think some of these mechanisms would still be there. So I think we could agree on at least trying to explore more, that there should be more exploring for the possibilities of handling some of the human rights violations and atrocities that have gone on in the Sudan on local levels, by trying to utilize some of the local mechanism in the absence of a judicial system that at the moment will not be able to do this job. And now I'm thinking more about stepwise thinking rather than anything else. I see that there are some questions coming up, but just before I turn to questions, a question for on the South Sudan situation, Kuyang. When you hear this talk about the South Sudan situation, would you say that you have some similarities in South Sudan when it comes to different mechanisms for solving conflicts?
In South Sudan, we have a legally pluralistic, judicial system.
Yes.
So we have a functional customary justice system at the lower level, which has litigated on issues at the family level and local level conflicts as well. And in our case, there's actually been discussions on how to embed traditional justice mechanisms, which are around customary norms, customary laws, to further reconciliation, resolution of local level conflicts. It was always the question of the place for that in the broader transitional justice framework. And, in South Sudan, the conversation has only just started. And this has been articulated as a way of dealing with the smaller perpetrators. As you said, we have massive local level and ethnic conflicts that have actually become more intense when compared to the national level conflicts. And yes, we have that. Just picking up on the discussion earlier on, one of the challenges we have with the formal judicial system is that it's really weak. Reforms are envisioned as part of the revitalized agreement, but then there's a tendency for the political leadership and military leadership to want a weak judiciary, which serves their interests. The judiciary is one with the executive has overbearing powers. So even attempts at reform are going to be difficult. So it's really difficult at this point, and our hope is in the agreement, which envisions a large-scale institutional reforms, including the judiciary. And we hope that our customary justice system, which is really functional and strong, can be embedded as part of the transitional justice framework to deal with lower level perpetrators.
Yeah, that was what I was hinting at. I think now when we are getting towards the end, there are 3 questions coming up so far. The first one was, do we get them on the screen? First question from Liv Tønnesen. I guess for Munzoul again, what about local reconciliation and transitional justice on issues related to sexual violence and rape in Darfur? Munzoul?
Well, I don't know how those will be addressed in Darfur. Because traditionally, this kind of crimes, rape, premarital pregnancy, and all of that, they deal with them in a traditional way that does not bring justice to the victims. Because in some cases, when someone rapes a girl or a woman, then if she is not married, then she might end up being forced to marry the person who raped her, because they see that as part of solving the problem. It might not be the case that this is gonna happen to all the cases, but that was something done in Darfur. But with the war in Darfur, and with the fact that rape has become a widespread crime, things might have changed. I don't know. I have no idea as of now what are the measures that are going to be taken to address this. But I do believe that when thinking about transitional justice, this is one of the key issues that would have to be dealt with. They might not be dealing with them as we speak, or through the local level initiatives that I spoke about at the beginning of the webinar. But there is no doubt that in any form of transitional justice that is going to be adopted, the issue of rape in Darfur would be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Then there is a question from, again to Munzoul, from Sarah Tobin. Have the recent events in Jerusalem, the bombings in Gaza, and perhaps most importantly, the change in government in Israel, altered the relationship between Sudan and Israel? And what are the prospects for this relationship in the future? It's a little bit on sideline of transitional justice, but still, of course, something that a lot of people will be concerned with. Munzoul, very briefly.
It's relevant actually, and I don't think these things that happen in Israel, including the change in the government, would affect what started between Sudan and Israel. I have been a believer that sooner or later this is going to happen. Sudan and Israel will normalize relationship. Nothing is going to stop this. Believe me, this is this has been my position since Burhan and Netanyahu met in Entebbe. This process is started, it's not going to stop.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then there is also a third question coming up from Endres de Jansen of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our special envoy on Sudan and South Sudan in Oslo. A question from Munzoul again. Would the establishment of the Transitional Legislative Assembly, which is long overdue, help progress on transitional justice and legal reform? If yes, why so little movement on this critical issue at the heart of the transition?
Well, thank you, Andrea, and I'm glad that you are attending the webinar with us. And Hamdok actually yesterday spoke about this, and he gave the partners 1 month to form the Transitional Assembly. I don't know what he's gonna do if 1 month passes and that's not happening. But the point to me, I really don't think that the Transitional Assembly is going to be critically useful. I'm saying this for the simple fact that the members of the Transitional Assembly are going to be coming from the partners of the transition. So we're not going to have, we already have the cabinet, we already have the sovereign council, and we already have the so-called partners council. And whatever assembly is going to be created, it's not going to be outside of these structures. They will bring their problems to the assembly. The same kind of, partisan bickering that's happening now will simply be transferred to the Transitional Assembly. I don't really think that the Transitional Assembly, to me as a citizen, it's irrelevant. It's not going to be better than the current structures because the members are going to be drawn from the same partners. So instead of becoming a useful structure, it's actually going to be a burden, And people were saying that, why should we pay money for people who are going to do nothing except like what they are doing currently in the existing structures? So people are becoming doubtful about the necessity of the assembly. The document that was signed in August 2019 talked about 90 days of establishing the transition. Now we are going to the third year, and the assembly is not there. So we are doubtful about the necessity of having the assembly anyway.
I think there are more questions coming up actually, but I was wondering before we. Yes, I can take this. Yeah, it's a good question again. Can we have a nation-building project that can combine both addressing violence committed by the previous regime as a criminal violence that requires headhunting perpetrators, and as political violence that will require maybe reconciliation with the former regime? So the issue of finding a balance between what we could call punitive justice on the one hand, and reconciling with all those people who are, for example, now in the judicial system as bureaucrats and so on and so forth, and where there is a need actually to get them on board somehow, get them on board.
No, I think for people, and as far as I understand the initiative of Prime Minister Hamdok, when he talked about reconciliation, he was talking about reconciliation within the FFC forces, not with the former regime loyalists. And with the former regime, there are two issues that we have to understand. First, the leaders who are in jail now, they are being tried for a lot of crimes, including the military coup in June 1989, plus what happens in other fronts, financial fraud and all of that. And the second issue relates to the uprooting the structures that were created by the former regime. So you cannot try the leaders and you cannot uproot their structures, and yet you say that I'm going to reconcile with them. This is contradiction in terms. So that is far-fetched. I don't think there would be reconciliation with the former regime soon, not before the trials are completed, and then this may happen. Of course, there are other forces, that were probably somehow related to the former regime, cronies, some, like the political parties that were part of the regime until its downfall. Those might, be considered in some form of reconciliation, but not the hardcore regime loyalists. That doesn't make sense, or at least as far as I can understand.
Yes, We are getting a number of questions still. Maybe we should take one or two more before we close and try to summarize what we have learned so far. There is a question which is almost like a comment as well, you know. Traditional courts almost never judge in favor of women. How can they then be the main judge? You know, I mean, this is a question about the potential role of traditional courts, you know, as we can see it moving forward. Any comment on this? This is, I guess, relates to what you've been talking about before. And the other issue maybe we'll just take to is that what I think we have touched upon, but it seems that the speakers are not addressing it. It says here that there is something we could call state criminality, and what models of transitional justice can be applied to Sudan when the current government not only lacks a vision, but they also lack willingness. And the same applies to South Sudan's hybrid court. So a lack of vision and a lack of willingness. Maybe we are getting Munzoul towards kind of a closing statement, but there are both these aspects, of course.
Yeah, I think these are all important questions and real issues that a lot of people are talking about. Now, even some people inside the country here are also talking about lack of willingness, lack of vision. But from what the government is doing, the cabinet, I mean, these people are serious about these issues. They might be, or actually, as a matter of fact, there is actually a tension within the government, as I mentioned in the beginning, between the military and the civilians. And this delays a lot of things, including, of course, the issue of transitional justice. But there is willingness, there is no question about this. And the very fact that these people, the government, is quite serious in uprooting the structures means that they are actually serious about justice. But it may take time, but I think it's going to happen. And again, this is also related to the investigation that is going on with regard to the brutal crushing of the sit-in. And the chairman of the committee, who is a respectable lawyer, a very experienced lawyer, was telling people that justice takes time, and we are trying to gather evidence that will stand in front of the court of law. Because if you hurriedly do the work and you go to the court might dismiss it, and that will be a serious problem, because there are people who have been killed, there are people who have been drowned, there are people who were tortured, and to have a court dismissing such a case, it would be disastrous. And I think this is also one of the things that people need to understand, that yes, justice is necessary, it has to be achieved, but it's going to take time, and you have to be patient, you have to be and of course, we all understand the pain that people are going through, but I think these processes take time. And we have seen also, as Elin rightly mentioned in her intervention, what happened in Latin America. Some cases were resolved after 30 or 40 years, you know. So it's time taking, it's time consuming, but I think the transitional government is willing to achieve justice. I think so.
Thank you, Munzoul. I think we are at the end of our webinar this morning. We cannot exhaust all the topics, and Anders Stiansen here has just launched an issue which could be a particular topic for another seminar, actually, because it relates to what we have been talking about and the democratic character of the transition. You know, have we given up on the democratic character of the transition, or are we just talking about that this will be a much more longer term process than we perhaps, or those in charge of the revolution, envisaged, you know, at the beginning of the revolution, and what can be done to restore the democratic process? Of course, there are many issues here, And some would also argue, for example, that the latest peace deals with the so-called other armed groups, are not necessarily working in favor of what we call transitional justice, because there are, as we talked about, there are atrocities on all sides here in many ways. But there is, of course, a special responsibility on part of the state, the Sudanese state, as it developed during the former regime. But we cannot really touch more upon this topic now. We are at the end. So I thank you all for listening in, and thank you very much to our panel here in Bergen, in Douala, Cameroon, and of course, particularly since we are dealing with the Sudan, Munzoul in Khartoum. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.